One of these versions is worth around $40 USD. The other version's worth over $1,000 USD. Can you tell just by looking at them which one's worth the big bucks? On Christmas Day 1996, I opened one heck of a gift. It was a gift that released me from my 8 and 16-bit restraints and for the very first time set me free into a 3D 64-bit world. And that gift was, of course, the Nintendo 64. I could not rip my Super Nintendo out of the wall to replace it with my new N64 fast enough, and once I did, I never looked back. But the real magic happened for me later when I played Mario 64 for the very first time. It was the most beautiful gaming moment that I've ever had, and honestly, I decided then and there that I wanted to experience and preferably even own every game that this system had to offer me. And as an adult, that's a goal that I really buckled down on and actually managed to pull off. I eventually actually managed to collect one each of every game released in North America for the N64, and I learned a ton about collecting for that system along the way. Like the fact that there would eventually be a grand total of 296 titles released for the N64 in North America, and out of those 296, a sizable handful of games could be considered uncommon or even rare titles, which means those games would command a little bit higher price tag than a common game would. But out of that handful of games, there are 5 specific titles that are guaranteed to send a chill down the spines of your average Joe everyday collector on a budget like me, and it's those 5 titles that I want to talk about in today's video. Some collectors know those games as the N64 heavies. My wife knows those games as the, "Are you fucking crazy? We can't afford to pay that kind of money for a Nintendo 64 game right now. Now get out of my bed and stop asking me about it." But I've simply come to know them as the most expensive fucking games on the Nintendo 64. So if you're a collector like me shooting for your own set of 296, or if you're just somebody that likes to learn about collecting for the N64, either way, kick back and I'll tell you everything I've come to know about the Nintendo 64's big, ball-busting 5. Now, I'll tell you the truth straight out of the gate. I love the Nintendo 64. That may be obvious, but I sincerely believe that it has one of the best libraries to be found in all of retro video game history. But that also begs the question, with a system that has so many great games to be found on it, why are only a handful of games considered by collectors to be what we would call heavies? That's honestly a pretty easy question to answer, though. Value in today's market has very little, if not nothing at all, to do with how good a game actually is, and has more to do with how rare the game is, and that could depend on several factors: how late the game was released in the system's life cycle, how well it was received, how many copies were sold, etc. Before we wade into this pool beyond balls deep, in case you haven't already figured it out, I think I should explain what I mean when I use the word heavy, because it'll probably pop up more than once in this video. But in the retro video game collecting world, collectors will use the term heavy to describe the most expensive and rarest titles in any given game set. So in the North American N64 set, there are several games that could be considered heavies, but today we're talking about the 5 rarest, most expensive, and hardest to track down titles in the bunch, starting from least expensive to most expensive. One of my favorite games on the planet, number 5, Worms Armageddon. First up on our big ball buster of a list is one of the most entertaining and fun multiplayer games on the N64 that most people don't even realize is on the Nintendo 64, Worms Armageddon. Now this is a game that me and my friends played the absolute unholy piss out of growing up, but we played it on the PS1, and then later one of us got a hold of a Dreamcast and then we played it on that. I had no earthly idea Worms Armageddon was on the N64 until way later when I actually started going for a complete Nintendo 64 set of my own. Worms Armageddon is one of the most hilariously violent video games that I've ever played in my life, and in it you can versus the computer or take on a group of up to 3 of your friends for a 4-player bloodbath of a good time. Assuming of course worms actually do have blood, that is. To sum up the premise of the game right quick, you and your worms simply choose from an interestingly hysterical yet ever-growing list of weapons, and from there you just stay up all night kicking the ever-loving hell out of your buddies, and in my case, later in life, my wife and kids. I could honestly go on all day about Worms Armageddon. It really is a retro game that I hold near and dear to my heart. But this video isn't supposed to be a review of these games. It's just supposed to get you familiar with the Nintendo 64 Big 5. So with that in mind, I'll do my best to keep my impulse to review and to talk about these games at length in check the best I can from here on out. To be completely honest, it's nice just to have a 4-player game that I can play with my family on the N64 that isn't emotionally attached to a humiliating childhood misunderstanding like one of those other Nintendo 64 4-player family games is for me. Jason, I need your help outside, bud. Yeah. Come in. What's up? Oh, God. Oh, yeah. Come. Nowadays, though, Worms Armageddon for the N64 is just a rare title mostly sought after by hardcore N64 collectors shooting for their own complete set. But even knowing that, it's still fun to compare the different prices between Worms Armageddon on all the various platforms out there. Worms Armageddon for the Sega Dreamcast currently runs around $25 to $35 USD for a complete copy, as to where Worms Armageddon for the PlayStation is even cheaper, starting at around $12 going up to around $25 on average. But Worms Armageddon on the N64 is a completely different beast, man, consistently selling for over $200 all the way up to close to $400 in perfect shape, and that's just for a loose copy. An authentic complete copy of Worms Armageddon 64 will cost you at least $1,200 and up for a good copy, and that's if you can even find one of these things. They very rarely pop up in decent shape. So again, that was Worms Armageddon for the Nintendo 64. Current average retail value, $216 USD. That is one of 5. Let's put it in its place and let's move on to the next one. Up next is the only bona fide sequel on this entire list, and it's kind of a weird one because it's a sequel that not many people seem to know exists, even though it's a sequel to an extremely iconic N64 game. Coming in hot is everyone's favorite little explosion junkie, number 4 on our big ball buster of a list, Bomberman 64: The Second Attack. Bomberman 64: The Second Attack is a really good example of a sequel being better than the first game, and in my opinion, it's a metric ton better than the first game, to be honest with you. Now, I'm not trying to knock Bomberman 64 in any way. Many people my age look back on it with great love. It's just when compared to the Second Attack, many flaws of Bomberman 64 start to shine through, and they shine through pretty brightly. But every single thing I remember just not liking about the original Bomberman 64 was sort of improved upon and even fixed in some cases when it came to the Second Attack. Just like many other games released in the N64 era, the goal of the game designers was pretty clear. Rip the 2D character from its 2D source material and slap it into a 3D world and hope it works. And in the case of Bomberman 64, it worked! Now, Bomberman 64 definitely gets props for introducing the adventure mode and battle modes. In adventure mode, you simply use bombs to both blast your way to the end of the game and kill enemies along the way, all the while tediously collecting things as you proceed. But that was basically the gist of it, and for me at least, it got kind of old pretty dang quick. The Second Attack also had an adventure mode, now called story mode, and I liked this one a lot better, and the simple non-review way for me to answer as to why that is would be to simply say, it flows better, and they introduced cool new things like elemental bombs to spice things up and to keep you on your toes. But it was the unbelievably fun battle mode that will forever give Bomberman 64 a place in our hearts. It was just a free-for-all where you dropped bombs until you were the last one standing, and we had hours of fun with it growing up. But the Second Attack stepped it up here too by somehow fixing something that wasn't broken, by expanding upon the already super awesome multiplayer battle mode, giving us way more options to choose from and different ways to kick the crap out of our friends. The original Bomberman 64, not the sequel, is not a bad game. It really isn't, but when I was a kid, I had way more than one lifetime's worth of gameplay experience shoved down my throat for Bomberman 64, and I just don't want to play it anymore after that, to be honest with you. Hey, Byrd, thanks for spending the night with me. No problem, Billy. This is awesome. Thanks for inviting me. What do you want to do first? Well, gee, you want to play Nintendo 64 with me? Yeah, I love Nintendo 64. I even brought my own controller. Well, good. We can play my favorite game in the world, Bomberman 64. But I don't want to play the super cool multiplayer mode. I want to play the single player adventure mode and take turns, and I'm first. Okay, that sounds great, man. Just lead the way. It's great. It'll be awesome. Well, golly gee, Byrd, can you believe I played Bomberman 64 for almost 23 hours on a single turn? Wasn't that fun? Billy, for the love of God, man, don't you have any other game at all other than that one that we could play? Well, of course I've got other games other than just that one, silly. I've also got my beautiful, precious backup copy of Bomberman 64. Oh, I know, we should play this one, but not the super cool multiplayer mode, the single player adventure mode, and take turns, and I'm first. Bomberman 64. Bomberman 64. The release of the Second Attack somehow managed to slip past our gaming radars at the time, and because of this, it didn't end up a staple in many of our collections like Bomberman 64 did, and thanks to that fact, it would ultimately become a pretty rare cartridge to run into nowadays. Bomberman 64: The Second Attack has a current average value of $239 USD, and that's for a loose copy. If you want a complete copy, be ready to pony up big, buddy, because they start at around $1,000 and go way up after that, depending on condition. Also, real quick, just because I know someone will mention it in the comments section, yes, I know there is a game called Bomberman Hero on the N64, but I don't count that as part of the Bomberman 64 series. Few people do, and I hate it, so yeah, there. And that was Bomberman 64, The Second Attack, which is a fitting name because it was also the second behemoth we had to tackle from the big 5 on our list. Let's put it in its place and let's move on to the next one. Next up is the first Blockbuster exclusive title on our list, a fairly decent racing game that kids like me that grew up nowhere near a Blockbuster video never got to play. Number 3, Stunt Racer 64. So at number 3, we have yet another example of a Nintendo 64 game that I had no clue even existed until I became a hardcore N64 collector later in life and started chasing a complete set. But, at least in the case of Stunt Racer 64, there's an extremely good reason as to why I didn't know about it. Stunt Racer 64 is a Blockbuster exclusive title, which means if you wanted to rent this game, you had to rent it from Blockbuster. And if you wanted to buy this game, you had to buy it from Blockbuster, but only after they were done renting it to you. And I know this is hard for some people to picture, but I was born in an area with 0 Blockbuster video stores. So I had to travel for 2 hours in any direction just to get to one of these places. But when I finally did get to play Stunt Racer 64 for the first time, I was somewhat pleasantly surprised. It's a pretty fun and decent game. But don't get me wrong, it is still very much a standard issue N64 era 3D racing game, kind of in the vein of something like Cruisin' USA, except in Stunt Racer, some of the tracks have loops and your car can do flips and spins and stuff, which makes it completely different. All jokes aside though, the whole trick mechanic and being able to do spins and flips with your car is actually pretty fun, and it definitely spices up the whole concept a little bit. All in all though, it's honestly kind of a bummer, because this is a game that I could really see me and my friends just burning up back in the day, but I never even got to hear about it growing up, let alone actually getting my hands on one to play it. And again, the reason for that was simple. Stunt Racer 64 had Blockbuster exclusive status, and there just wasn't any Blockbuster video stores anywhere near me growing up. So finding a Blockbuster exclusive title like Stunt Racer 64 in the wild near here at a yard sale or a flea market or something is practically impossible. Which is why Stunt Racer 64 actually has the unique distinction for being one of the most expensive games I've ever actually paid for outright in my collection. When it popped up, I was actually kind of shocked. It was a little banged up, but I got a good deal on it. I gave $200.
You spent how much money? Oh, you in the doghouse.
Holy jumping metal Jesus, I've done it now! So the fact that Stunt Racer 64 is a Blockbuster exclusive title is a big reason as to why it's so rare and why it's on this list, but it's not the only reason. I mean, heck, there's other N64 titles that are also Blockbuster exclusives that are nowhere near as expensive or as hard to find as something like Stunt Racer. And I personally think it's a combination of a couple of things that make Stunt Racer so special in this regard. One, it was a racing game. Albeit a pretty good racing game, but a racing game nonetheless. And 2, it was released pretty late in the life cycle of the Nintendo 64. It came out in October of the year 2000, and that's especially crazy when you realize that the PS2 released in North America later that very same month. And 3, like I've already said, it was a Blockbuster exclusive, which means it was a limited release. Combine all these things together and add a few years, and you have yourself a recipe for a collecting wet dream. Stunt Racer 64 has a current average value of $320 USD for a loose copy, but I can tell you, nice loose copies definitely go for more than that these days. And if you want an authentic complete copy of this one, hold your breath because they start at around $2,500 and go way up from there. And that's all for Stunt Racer 64. Let's put it in its place and move on to the next one. Up next is a game that most people would never dream they would find on a top 5 most expensive and rarest games of all time list just based on the title of the game alone. And I can completely understand where those people were coming from, but I'm also here to tell you exactly why those people were 100% wrong. This game is an absolute pain in the ass for any collector shooting for a complete N64 set. Crashing in at number 2, Super Bowling 64. Out of all the extremely expensive and super rare video games out there in the retro video game collecting world, Super Bowling 64 is one of my personal favorites, and it's simply because it's just a weird one. It's a game that you would never expect to be so expensive or so rare, and that's what makes it special. It's the kind of game that you can find for $5 if you're super lucky, because the guy that sold it to you just didn't know any better. Now I'm sure me just saying the name Super Bowling 64 is enough to make some of you start to yawn, but I've got to tell you, man, it's actually a pretty good game. It's by far my favorite bowling game that I've ever found on any system out there ever, but I can't exactly recommend that you run out and pick up a copy of your own because it's stupid expensive, unless you're rich, in which case, do whatever you want, it's all good. But I can tell you a little bit about the game. It's a bowling game, so you of course have the standard bowling option, but the coolest part of the game is the acquisition mode. You start out being able to choose from 2 characters, and you can actually pick them based on their specs, which is pretty cool. Then you play hidden characters with the hopes of beating them so you can unlock them. Each hidden character has their own secret hidden lanes, and those get progressively cooler and more unique as you move through the game. It's actually a really cool concept to see in a bowling game, especially back then. As the lanes change, your gameplay style has to change too. Obviously, the ball is going to behave different on a grass lane versus an ice lane. It's pretty cool, man. It's something that's kind of hard to explain until you try it, but I like it. Super Bowling 64 also has a not-so-fun mode called Golf Mode, which I'm not a fan of at all. I've played it like twice and never went back to it. If you're going to play this game, play the Acquisition Mode. It's actually a lot of fun. And then, of course, we can't forget the good old-fashioned Standard Bowling Mode, which everyone knows and loves, and this game does that mode very well too. But for me, what makes Super Bowling 64 so special is Acquisition Mode. It makes it a game that's more than just a bowling game to me, and that's why it's got a special place in my heart, at least. Now, with all that said, let me ask you this. How in the earthly does a game like Super Bowling 64 end up on a top 5 rare and most expensive Nintendo 64 games of all time list? Now, I could lie and tell you there's a lot to it, but to be honest, there's only 2 real reasons why Super Bowling 64 is so hard to find and so expensive these days. One, it's a bowling game. Not exactly the most popular type of game ever and never will be. But the big reason is that it was a super late release title for the N64. It came out in January of the year 2001. I mean, the friggin' GameCube came out later in the year 2001, so even Nintendo had started to move on at this point. Combine both of those factors, and it's pretty easy to picture that Super Bowling 64 wasn't exactly flying off the shelves at the time. Super Bowling 64 has a current average value of $500 USD for a copy in good shape, but I've seen really nice copies sell for north of $700 USD depending on the situation, and that's for a loose copy. If you want a really nice complete copy, well, sit down because they start at around $3,000 and go way up from there depending on condition, and if you want a graded copy, good luck because people ask insane amounts for them. Super Bowling 64 is a game that I chased for years, and since my budget would never allow for me to actually just go out and buy the game at retail, I only really had 2 options to choose from to get this game into my collection. One was the nuclear nutty option, and that was just to ask my wife for permission to buy the game. Honey, do you care if I put $600 on one of our credit cards so I can buy a bowling game for the Nintendo 64? I'll take that as a maybe. And since that had basically no chance of working, my only other real option was just to be patient and hope like hell that I would eventually get lucky enough to find a copy of Super Bowling out in the wild somewhere. And to my absolute surprise, that is exactly what happened. After a few years of looking for my own copy, I eventually found a copy at the flea market in a big box of games that I got for $100. That's all I have to say now for Super Bowling 64. Let's put this game in its forever home and move on to the last big baddie on our list. Up next on our list, last but certainly not least in our case, is the biggest, baddest ball buster of the bunch. The game that single-handedly stops most of us collectors from actually being able to finish our North American commercially released N64 game set. The most expensive and hardest to track down game in the wild for the N64. Number 1, Clay Fighters. But real quick, there's actually an interesting curveball that makes this one so much fun. Did you know that there's actually 2 different versions of Clay Fighter for the Nintendo 64? Not 2 completely different games, 2 different versions of the same game. There's this version, and then there is this version. One of these versions is worth around $40 USD. The other version's worth over $1,000 USD. Can you tell just by looking at them which one's worth the big bucks? Well, stick around to the end of the video and I might just tell you which one's which. It's this one. This one's worth the big bucks. But stick around with me anyway. Number 1, Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut. So here's the $1,000,000 question. Out of all the possible commercially released games in North America for the N64, why is it that Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut went on to become the most valuable? And that also begs the question, if Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut is just a different version of Clay Fighter 63 and a third, why in the earthly is one of these versions worth so much more than the other? Well, remember earlier in the video when we talked about Blockbuster exclusive status? Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut is the king Blockbuster exclusive N64 title. And on top of the fact that it was a Blockbuster exclusive, Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut was just an updated version to an already extremely popular N64 game at the time, Clay Fighter 63 and a third, a game that many people already had, myself and all of my friends included. So even if somebody that already owned Clay Fighter 63 and a third wanted to run out and get this particular version of the game, they would have to go to a Blockbuster video and hope like hell that they had a pre-played version of Sculptor's Cut ready to sell them. And apparently there was ever only 20,000 copies of Sculptor's Cut even produced, so you combine these facts together and that is more than enough to drive Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut to the number 1 spot on our big ball busting 5 list, hands down. Me, all my friends, and everybody else who wasn't born just down the road from a Blockbuster video, however, grew up playing Clay Fighter 63 and a third, a pretty fun fighting game that allowed us to take out all of our childhood frustrations by kicking the crap out of each other at too many sleepovers to even count. I cannot tell you how many hundreds of hours were spent by me and my friends mastering Clay Fighter 63 and a third and becoming intimately familiar with every single character the game had to offer. So you can imagine our confusion when at one of these childhood sleepovers, the new kid at school, who had just recently moved to our small town from a neighboring city, was going on and on about how our copy of Clay Fighter seemed to be broken because it was missing his favorite character in the world, Lady Liberty. We just thought he was an insane liar, and we practically threatened to make him sleep outside of the sleepover until he changed his tune, but he was willing to die on that hill, man. Come on, guys, come on. on, Byrd. Let me back in. This is insane, man. So are you finally ready to admit that there is no Lady Liberty in Clay Fighter 64? No, I will never admit that Lady Liberty is not in Clay Fighter 64. I've beat Clay Fighter 64. I know she's a character in it. Well, I've also beat it. We've all also beat it. None of us have ever seen a character named Lady Liberty in Clay Fighter 64 in all the many hours that we've played that game. Explain that. Well, guys, I'm never going to admit that Lady Liberty is not a real character, so I guess just do your worst with me. All right, man. Suit yourself. Just enjoy hanging out all night with him. With who? Howdy, Josh! Hey, Billy. Did those boys dare you to sleep out in the snow too? Isn't that silly? But now that there's two of us, I know exactly what we can do. We can talk about the best video game ever made, Bomberman 64. But I don't want to talk about the super fun multiplayer mode. I want to talk about the single player adventure mode and take turns, and I'm first. Alright guys, I admit it. Totally made her up. There is no Lady Liberty in Clay Fighter 64. You got me. Let me in. Of course, many years later, I would go on to find out the truth, which was kind of a twist ending, but ultimately, we were all 100% correct. There was no Lady Liberty in the Clay Fighter that me and my friends grew up with, but there was a Lady Liberty in the Clay Fighter that Josh grew up with. It's just, we didn't have a Blockbuster Video anywhere nearby, so we had no way of knowing about the version that offered her as a playable, unlockable character. I would eventually go on to learn, though, that Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut was nothing more than an updated version of Clay Fighter 63 1/3. It had a bit better of a story, updated gameplay, and a few extra characters and stages for us to play around on. But the way Sculptor's Cut slipped into the world quietly as a Blockbuster exclusive, to the point where kids like me thought it was nothing more than legend or myth, really helped solidify its place as the most expensive Nintendo 64 game in today's market. Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut is standing tall with a current average value of $1,023 USD, and that's for a loose copy, and that's with or without the cool Property of Blockbuster sticker like you see here on mine. I personally love these stickers, and other collectors do too, but some collectors prefer not to have them. But honestly, it doesn't really hurt the value one way or another if they're on there, as long as the cart and label is in good shape otherwise. The complete copies almost never pop up for sale, but when they do, they almost always go from between $7,000 USD and $10,000 USD, depending on condition and completeness. Here recently, though, history was made when one of only 2 known sealed copies of Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut sold for $175,000 at a heritage auction. That's just nuts when you think about it, man. That's all I have to say about Clay Fighter Sculptor's Cut for now, so let's put it in its place and step back and admire the glory of the Nintendo 64's Big Ball-Busting 5. Well, that's my list for the Nintendo 64 Big 5, and if you're still watching at this point, thank you. This video took me friggin' months to put together. Kentucky had some crazy weather. I've been busy, so I've only been able to do this in my most downest downtime, so thank you so much for watching. If you like this kind of content, consider liking and subscribing for more. I'll have more videos coming out just around the corner. Don't forget to remember how friggin' awesome you guys are, and I will see you on the next one.